Hey, right. A couple of weeks ago, I made the comparison video between the Royal Enfield Classic 350 and the GB 350S from Honda. Now, it was a difficult video to make because I knew what the answer to this comparison was going to be, but at the same time, I'm a big Royal Enfield fan. Whereas where Honda's concerned, I've got no sort of connection with Honda. It's not a brand I particularly am loyal to. I've never owned a new Honda. Now, in the video where I sort of asked for people's opinions, which comparison they would like to see, one or two people asked for the Hunter, and I understand why they've done that, although I think it's a little bit misguided. I'll explain why in a moment. But overwhelmingly, everybody wanted a comparison between the GB 350 and the Classic 350 from Royal Enfield. And in my mind's eye, that actually made the most sense because, technically, specification-wise, the Classic 350 and the GB 350 are the closest in similarity. The Hunter is a completely different animal. I think those few that asked for the Hunter is either, they're looking at buying a Hunter, so they wanted that particular comparison. But I think in most cases, talking to people in the comments section, it was because aesthetically, they think the bikes look similar, even though specification-wise, steering geometry, everything, the worlds apart from each other. But then when I made that Classic versus GB 350 video, lots of people, and I mean lots of people, jumped into the comments section and said, well, a more appropriate bike would be a comparison with the Hunter, not the Classic 350. I disagree, but a few of those people actually got quite heated about the subject, and that's why I never wanted to make these videos in the first place. I was reluctant because I try my best to keep this channel as positive as possible, yet at the same time I've always used honesty as the benchmark for all the reviews that I've done, and I knew that if I was going to be honest, the Hunter wouldn't come out well against the GB 350. Back in 2022, leading into 2023, I had the privilege of riding a Royal Enfield Hunter 350, the one that you're looking at now, for a total of 6 weeks. I had one for long enough to form an honest and accurate opinion of the bike. Now, at that time in the UK, this basically for a 1970s style roadster was the only model available. In the 350cc category, there was nothing else like it at the time. It's a thoroughly enjoyable, likeable bike, and at that time, it was the best in its class because it was the only bike occupying that class, basically. But the motorcycle industry is just like any other industry. The top product for a particular year will be superseded by other brands or other models from the same brand as time goes on. It's called progress. Things change. Nothing ever stays the same. Now, there were several sort of arguments erupted regarding Honda and Royal Enfield and the various timelines, imagined or otherwise, how Honda is an imposter that's just trying to sort of cash in on Royal Enfield's success, which I think there's probably an element of truth to that, but it's not the whole story. I'll fill you in on that in a moment. And how I failed to bring emotion into the comparison between, the two bikes. Now, I can't use emotion as a benchmark in a comparison video simply because, for a start, my emotions towards any particular brand or model are going to be completely different from anybody else's emotions towards the same subject. So, how can I convey that to you as, a factual reason for giving one product precedence over the other? I have to go on facts. I have to go on what I can touch, see, taste and smell. If I used brand loyalty as a benchmark for any comparison that I make, Royal Enfield would win every single time. But it wouldn't be a fair comparison, it would be biased. So obviously I can't do that. There's no doubt about it, emotions are a huge factor in people's buying decisions with any of these models. Probably about 60% of the buying decision, if I'm honest. And that's perfectly legitimate. At the end of the day, it's whichever sort of model or brand sings to you is the one that you will choose, even if technically or quality-wise it may be inferior to the bike that you're comparing it against. The other bike in your list of possible purchases. And Royal Enfield is a very emotionally charged brand. Their marketing is excellent. I think they're probably the best in the business, and they know exactly what buttons to push. And that's not a criticism. Royal Enfield have come a long way. They've come from really obscurity in the Western world in 5 years to one of the leading brands, and that's got to be applauded. Now, I think Royal Enfield's marketing is very honest. I'd like to get that out there from the start. But it does leave a lot of space whereby, if you like, fans will get an unrealistic idea of timelines, who did what first and when. And that became a big bone of contention in the comments of that Classic versus GB video that I made. Now, this is where the Copycat imposter Honda motorcycles came into play in the comments section over Royal Enfield, which is a genuine brand that's been going since 1901. Well, yeah, they have and they haven't. Now, I have sort of dealt with this in previous videos, including the video that we're talking about here today, but a lot of people simply choose to ignore that because it's all part of that emotive response. It doesn't fit with their idea of how it should be. Now, the current Royal Enfield motorcycles actually started off as Madras Motors, who formed a partnership with Royal Enfield here in the UK back in 1954 to fulfill an order for, I think it was 800 military motorcycles, Bullet 350s. Madras Motors simply attained the rights to build one model under license, and in an agreement with Royal Enfield, renamed the brand to Enfield India, not Royal Enfield. Now, this was common practice all over the world with all different manufacturers. BMW Motorcars started off building Austins under license, and they learned from there to build their own models. Kawasaki, same thing with BSA back in the 1950s. Hence the Kawasaki W800, which is a direct descendant of those original BSAs. But where Enfield India were concerned, they continued to build those Bullet 350s and later the Bullet 500s right up until the 1990s. But they had no real affiliation with Royal Enfield. They couldn't call themselves Royal Enfield because they were not Royal Enfield. They were simply a company making bikes under license. And they only had the rights to build one particular specific model, the Bullet, the 1954 Bullet. Now, the fortunes were failing by the early 1990s, and they needed rescuing because, they were building old bikes which simply didn't stack up against the competition, which were essentially modern bikes from, Japan and other places. They were, in fact, on the verge of bankruptcy when Eicher Motors bought them. Now, obviously, Eicher Motors wanted to rebuild that motorcycle brand, but they were tarred with the same brush, if you like. They were stuck with the same problem. They only had the rights to build one model, and they didn't have the rights to the Royal Enfield name, so they spent several years attaining the legal rights to the name and obtaining the legal rights to build new models. And the Royal Enfield name wasn't actually reintroduced until 1997. So in reality, the Royal Enfield name at that point had been dead for almost 30 years. Honda, on the other hand, have been going since the early 1950s, and they've stayed under the same ownership throughout that period of time. without any buyouts or legal ownership changes. So, in reality, if you want to be really pedantic about it, Honda's history is both longer and more genuine than Royal Enfield's. Now, the other accusation, of course, that was being thrown about is that this is the first modern classic motorcycle that Honda have come up with, whereas Royal Enfield have been doing it for decades. Well, no, actually they haven't. The classic range, the 350 and the 500, didn't come along until 2009. It's actually a very new model. Triumph built their first modern classic motorcycle, the Bonneville, back in 2004 or 2005. And get this, Honda brought their first purpose-built, designed and built from the ground up modern classic motorcycle in 1984, the GB500. It's just that the world of motorcycling wasn't ready for it yet. They were 40 years ahead of the game, so it didn't really sell very well. Up until 1997, Royal Enfield, or Enfield India, wasn't building modern classics. They were building an old, obsolete model from 1954, because that's all they had the rights and the capabilities to build. That's why they got into trouble. It had become irrelevant. No one wanted it. And for the first few years of the 21st century, they were trying the best to modernise it and make it look more like a modern motorcycle with bikes like the Thunderbird in order to try and stay relevant in the market. And I think if you look at the timeline, the reasons for the introduction of their first Bullet and classic modern classics come down to two things. One was that they realised that actually a modern classic was an upcoming class in motorcycles, and it was something that they could do, which also tied in well with their own domestic market that resisted change and wanted something like the old Bullet. And of course, if that's what their public wanted, Royal Enfield made sure that's what they got, and the unit construction Bullet and Classic were born. Now, once bitten, twice shy, Honda had obviously come a cropper with the GB500 back in the 1980s, so they had been reluctant to try that trick again. Up until 2020, they saw that the Asian market's popular 350cc class was embracing the concept of modern classic motorcycles, so they introduced their CB350 Highness. That was in 2020, remember. Now, the accusations that were thrown at Honda in the comments section on that video was that Honda had copied the concept of the Hunter in order to try and get a piece of Royal Enfield's market. The Hunter is a very successful model, but the Honda CB350 Highness predates the Hunter by 2 years. An irrefutable historical fact that a lot of those accusers chose to overlook, apart from one or two people who jumped on those comments and pointed out that actually it's more likely the Hunter is a copy of the Honda CB350, because when you look at the Hunter, it actually has, as a modern classic, no relevance in Royal Enfield's historical lineup of motorcycles. In fact, in my review of that bike 2 years ago, I mooted that actually it was a generic copy of Japanese motorcycles from the 1970s. Now, different people will have different views on this, but when I look at the Hunter, I see some Yamaha influence sort of mixed in with the original Bullet design. Now, I don't know what the thought processes were at Royal Enfield when the Hunter concept first came into being, but I think anybody can be forgiven for thinking that the Hunter was a response to the Honda CB350 Harness, not the other way around. Now, again, it's the concept of once bitten, twice shy. Honda made it very clear from the inception of the CB350 Harness that it was for the Asian market only and it would never be introduced to Europe or the UK. And they only relented on that stance when they were subject of quite a intense online campaign by Honda fans who insisted that they wanted it in their home markets in Europe, the UK and Australia. So Honda gave in. They rebadged the Highness CB350 as the GB350S, gave it a bit of a facelift in order to, shall we say, appeal more to Western tastes. And here it is. Now, personally, I loved the look of the harness, but obviously Honda thought it needed to be de-blinged a little bit for the UK and European market. But it's early days. The GB350S has only just been introduced into these markets. If it's successful, I think we could well see other models. Now, that brings us on to the GB350C, the classic version of this bike. And I have already made a video explaining some points about that model here on this channel some months ago. But again, it came up in the comments section on that last video that I made on the subject. Now, the GB350C does look quite a lot like a Royal Enfield Classic. And yes, I've got no doubts that Honda's decision to make that model was influenced by the success of the Royal Enfield. But it's not, as a lot of people claim, a direct copy of the Classic. It's actually taken inspiration from the 1950s dream models of that Honda produced. And that's why it's been now introduced into the Japanese market, because the Japanese wanted a piece of their own motorcycling heritage to be embodied in a modern classic. And although I couldn't earmark a specific Honda model from the 1950s, it is without a doubt very similar to some of the Honda dream models of the 1950s. You see, in the 50s, Honda was about a decade behind everybody else in motorcycle development because they were a new company. So they were making motorcycles that sort of really looked like bikes from the 1940s or even the late 1930s. They were still learning the craft. So there are many Japanese riders who remember the fathers or the grandfathers owning those bikes, and that's the appeal of the 350C. Just as people in my age group, and I know this from the comments again from that video, gravitate towards the GB350S because this bike embodies the Japanese motorcycles that we all actually grew up with. Now, I sincerely hope that this video has clarified things a little bit for some people. You know, it's very easy to accuse motorcycle manufacturers of copying off each other. I mean, I think really they've all done it at one time or another, but it's perfectly legitimate for a company like Honda to have a go at a market that, to be honest, they started back in the 1980s. Brand loyalty and wishful thinking does not trump historical fact. Just buy whatever brand and model of motorcycle speaks to you. There's no need to sort of deride other people's choices to justify your choice. All motorcycles are fantastic. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if you would leave a like on this video if you've enjoyed it, and consider subscribing to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. You can help me out in other ways via my Patreon page or via PayPal donations, or you can use the super thanks button down below. Either way, it's much appreciated. I am of course going to be back next week, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.